Awesome. So our speaker tonight is George Bryant. George is a partner at Fulton Analytics. Fulton Analytics is a Minnesota-based data analytics strategy and consulting company committed to delivering data success. And tonight, George will be talking about data platform preparation in Azure for AI. In this session, he will dive into how you can create a solid foundation using basic data engineering techniques on the Microsoft Azure platform. So there's a lot more to that, but that's my short, brief intro, because I know George is going to talk a little bit about himself and his company and going to show some demos and stuff. So I'll let you take it away from here, George. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
No worries. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so before I even get started with anything else, I love interactivity. If you want to just stop me, ask questions. I know Alison, I think Justin mentioned that you'll be following the chat channel or whatever that is. If you want to stop me and throw the figurative tomatoes at me, I'm absolutely fine with that too. Abuse is welcome. I'll let Alison handle it though, so that's all good. But yeah, am I sharing? I'm not sharing, am I?
You're sharing.
Oh, I am sharing. Oh, excellent. So yeah, my name is George. As Justin introduced me, I'm one of the partners of Fulton Analytics, and really what we do is data platform, is sort of a lot of front-end visualizations and a lot of prep work for machine learning teams. We certainly do a little bit of that ourselves. We don't have a large team in that, but you know, what I'm going to go through is a lot of the conversations of what I see on a day-to-day basis, and even over the last few years on how these conversations generally come up. I wouldn't be surprised if there was many in the room who will sort of sympathize and empathize with a lot of the things that I'll introduce with. I'm always going to be willing to hear people's experiences with that stuff too, because it is interesting. But basically my day-to-day role these days is less actual hands-on and more facilitating people, more allowing people to, and training people to go and do the work that I set up for them, and they go and do it based upon conversations and architecture until they're more trained up, and then they can move on. So that inherently means a large part of my role as well is sort of technical pre-sales. And so in that technical pre-sales world, so much of what I come across is I want to do AI. I want to get into the machine learning space. I want to do many different things. And nearly every single time, the answer is, okay, well, let's have a look at your data. Let's see where you're at. And no one, or 90% of it is the data isn't ready. Simple as that, which is kind of the focus I get on that today. The other 90%, which I know is crap math, so bear with me, is people, when they say AI, when they say machine learning, really they want some reports and they just want some little pretty pictures, and then that for them is as advanced as they want to go. So I generally see the gambit as it spans out. So yes, I feel like in some ways I do have a great perspective on some of the conversations that go around this. But as we go through, I really want to show what it is that we're doing, and how we prepare for a lot of those things, and how you yourselves can hopefully, through very simple methods, scale a lot of the things that you're creating, really depending on the scenario. So first and foremost, obviously my email address is up on the screen, if I'm showing the correct one. Most people, of course, if you want to follow me on LinkedIn or connect with me on LinkedIn, that's normally the avenue which I am most responsive on, for sure. Just because I do enjoy the platform, I do enjoy a lot of the conversations there. Some of them can get tedious, by all means, just like any essentially social media platform. But yeah, that's really a great place to see what's going on, what I'm up to, and hopefully some of my dull witticisms as they come through. So yeah, data prep can be easy, can be hard. Let's go for the easy one. That's really what I'm aiming at. So I'm going to kind of start off with an example reference architecture. Now, I'm not ignorant to the fact that if people are doing AI, people are doing machine learning, there's loads of flavors of that. There's absolutely you know, I mean, true data science, true algorithmic pieces are going through a lot more complex platforms than Azure machine learning. I'm very aware of that. Machine learning is great for some automation pieces. It's great for people that are getting their feet wet, but it's an example of where people would use it. Getting data prepared, there are some people that want some mildly curated data. There's some want the rawest form of the data available. There really is that many options for people to follow that path with. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give some proper context as to where I sit and where Fulton in general kind of does sit. And then from there, I'm going to start expanding out and seeing how you can both utilize the tools that are available. And, you know, the intention is for you to really see how easy it is to use a lot of these. And how it can assist some of the conversations that you have both with yourselves, with your teams, or however you're using your platform here. I'll also be clear, I think the only mention of ChatGPT that's going to happen was just then, or when Justin said it. I don't have any integrations with that at this point. That's really not my focus at this time. Except to say that it really is quite good at finishing code when you put in the beginning pieces. It gives you ideas and stuff. So the experience I've had with it is, you know, if you know, every day you're going through, you're doing your process, you're doing your code, you're doing whatever it is you do. Every now and then you just come up to that roadblock and you just think, well, I could headbutt the wall for another hour, or I could walk away and come back tomorrow morning. What ChatGPT has been very good for is getting over that hump and just saying, I can't figure this out. Here's the basis of the code. How do I do this? And then it just gives you those ideas. So if you are on a rush and you don't have time to wait for tomorrow morning, that's when it's been amazing for me. Okay, so I'm going to run through this briefly, what this is showing and how it sort of puts itself together. So over here are the data sources. Now, data can come from anywhere. You know, we're in a gold mine of data these days. There's obviously there's database data, with the example being SQL Server. There's Excel, CSV, Parquet. There's all the spanning the gambit, the gauntlet, sorry, and then the whole API, cloud-based, marketing-based data, everything that you can think of, it's available and it has data attached to it. So what kind of happens in this reference architecture is we use this program called Data Factory. Now, I don't know if anyone is familiar with Data Factory. That honestly is going to be a large amount of the preparation work that we're going to be going through today. I know Data Factory is something that is used for data engineering very often. And as you may have been able to tell, I have doubled down on the Microsoft space, so I do apologize if there are some more platform agnostic or other platforms available. However, the concepts that work with Data Factory, they also work with AWS, they also work with Google. It doesn't necessarily matter. This is just the medium that I'm most familiar with, so that's the one I'm going to show. Conceptually, none of these things change if you go to any of them. And you'll find that when you are in that data, you know, I have started working with AWS a lot more. Just the same stuff with a slightly different name and, you know, a different price point. You know, so go figure. So, you know, apologize and bear with me on that part, but that's kind of where we're at. So in general, as part of a data platform, a good, solid, well set up data platform, you can pull your multiple sources in. Data Factory is excellent at data movement. You can land it generally in a data lake or data lake equivalent, in blob storage, whatever it is. Now, this is the avenue where a lot of people will say, well, this is the data I've got. I've got the data in the blob storage or in the data lake Gen 2, whatever the scenario is for you. And this is the data I'm going to start using. The reason a lot of people put it there is volume. So if you have a lot of files that have to be accessed, if you have like large, very large files which need to be broken up and compacted into the Parquets and the CSVs and all the other host of different things that are there. If there's XMLs and JSONs, that's a great avenue for landing those things and moving things on. Now, what some people like to do, which is where analytics especially starts coming into play, is moving it from that scenario and refining it in a way which you can dimensionalize and modernize, normalize, sorry, into a SQL Server database or another data lake. It kind of depends. The other visual I have is the other version of that. So there's definitely the data flow into another data lake method. There's the other one, which is data lake going into a SQL server, where a lot of people are more comfortable using a more direct SQL solution. That's not to say there aren't tools that can go out and face a data lake, such as Synapse, such as Snowflake, what's the other, Databricks? Sorry, that's the best example. It's not to say you can't go out and read directly from them using SQL statements to bring that data through and work with it there. That's absolutely fine. There really are many flavors of the same thing again. But the key part is that there is a differentiation between that staging landing environment where you can access the data and blast things through versus a slightly more curated, somewhat cleaned up. I prefer to be cleaning data as opposed to changing data. That's a very clear differentiation I try and make with things. No one's taking data away, but there is an element of cleaning up more attribute-based data. A transaction that's occurred is a transaction that's occurred. You should not be deleting those. You should at least be trying to have them cleaned up and make sense, but don't be deleting that stuff. And then in the scenario of anyone that's doing visualization, Power BI and data sets, moving it into reports, all those different things, and you can move it through. So all of these kind of do have the tools that you have that you need in order to achieve. So again, what I'm really hoping to do today is I'm going to focus on this data extraction piece and bringing it into a data lake, and where necessary, bringing it through into a SQL server. So my focus today is on that. I'm going to give some real life examples with non-proprietary data, of course, of showing the flows and how you can start analyzing the data to determine what the definition of clean is, just from that data sort of modeling perspective, and testing and feasibility perspective. So if there's any part in there that you want to stop and ask questions, absolutely feel free to go ahead. I'm going to show a very straightforward method and kind of a how-to on how to get these things going through and going forward. But I can speak to the conceptually to anything beyond what I'm showing today. So yeah. I didn't hear if that was someone asking a question. It didn't sound very clear.
Hey, George, this is Arjun here. I just have some questions regarding the selection of data factory versus Databricks. So what are the scenarios how you're going for data factory, and what scenarios I've seen looking at the Azure architecture as a standard practice? When I've seen there is a scenario where when we are persisting the data from using the data factory to Azure Gen 2 or something, after that cleansing process is going through Databricks. Can we use data factory? What would be the difference between using data factory there or Databricks out there?
That's a great one. So I think there's so many different flavors of it. So I've seen scenarios where people use data factory to extract the data and then land it, and then Databricks comes into play going against the data lake environment. I think that's the usual use case I see, because Databricks is especially powerful as a tool in general. It's one of the best tools out there, it really is, and some of the things they've been doing are great. But what I think a lot of people have better comfort with is if they can land all of the data using Data Factory to bring it from the on-premise source up into the cloud, then you can do them in some slightly more consistent ways by having, in the scenarios where you need things like the integration runtime and other ways of connecting on-premise to cloud, the Microsoft built-in tools are really very mature in that sense. So the most common scenario I see is Data Factory to get it to this sort of staging area. It just brings it through as is, and then that's normally where Databricks picks up. Everything's got data in the name. It's annoying. Databricks picks it up, and then that's where a lot of people really start doing a lot of the work. So Databricks oftentimes can replace this whole blue block over here. Sometimes people do that in parallel too, because there's obviously the reporting environment and analytics environments versus, you know, the more algorithmic, senior complex pieces where it goes a lot more into machine learning and AI. So that's normally the scenario you'll see. There are instances where you can just have Databricks do the entire thing, but I've only really ever seen that in one source scenarios, not multiple sources. Not that it can't be done, but that's just sort of the use cases I've seen.
Thank you for that insight, George. And one more question here is, so the point where we have it's Azure ML there. So differentiation on using Azure machine learning, I mean the services which Microsoft is providing, the new service which called OpenAI. So OpenAI services, what is there is a differentiation between Azure ML, which we are using these licenses here, to Open Azure AI services, which newly released. Is that differentiation in the libraries or services or licensing?
That's not a question I know the answer to. I'll be honest. That's that goes a little bit beyond and a little bit newer from the space that I'm in.
Okay.
But that's definitely. I mean, it's a good question, and I kind of want to know the answer myself. But I'm not here to pretend I know answers when I know I don't. Normally, so for clarity, when this line starts off here, that's when I stop off. The most common use case that I've seen people use here is not actually the machine learning piece, but the Cosmos DB and going into, I mean, you can interact. Mongo is not so much in there anymore, but Cosmos DB is the usual use case that I see people pick up from, and people do connect to either the lake or the a SQL server for that. So, but the actual the answer to the question itself, I'm afraid I do not know.
Thank you for all the insight. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, so I am fully aware that I may be preaching to the choir on some of these next pieces as we go through, but I am going to pick up and begin us a demo on how to pick things up and move them all the way through. Nice and simple, and just going through from there. So allow me one moment and I'll I always forget, I don't use the thingy often enough. There we go. Oh, forgot about that background. Apologies. So here, what we're going to do today is we're going to pick up and move into, that's the wrong browser. I've got too many. I don't know if anyone else is in the scenario where you have access to multiple different environments. And so when that's the case, you generally find yourself with multiple different browsers to get to the multiple different environments with the multiple different logins that you have to prevent conflicts with everything. So I've just accidentally opened the wrong one, but this is the correct one.
I think it's called agile.
Yes, I'm going with it. That's a good one. Okay, so out of interest, I'm wondering how many people actually have an Azure environment that they actively use and who really does not. Mostly from the context of, are you familiar with at least sort of how it set itself up and how to add these things? That was the most ambiguous question ever. I'll take it as I need to ask better questions and just move on and sort of walk through. But yeah, if you don't have Azure and you haven't gotten and you've never worked with an environment before, the very basic concept, you know, Azure works very well with resource groups. They're good ways of bucketing, as you see in that scenario, different demos. If you have multiple teams working within a subscription, you can break it up by, this is our analytics team, this is our advanced analytics teams and machine learning, this is sort of more DR and disaster recovery teams. And so you can break it up into multiple different pieces. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to create our own resource group. And then it's just really as simple as that. A resource group, there's no cost associated with a resource group. It's a container, essentially. And so when you have a container and then there's nothing in it, there's nothing associated with it. It's just a good way when you start doing your cost analysis. It's a great way of breaking things up and seeing where your costs are located and how you can sort of get through. So I'm going to go from the most basic element of how to create Data Factory, because that's ultimately the very important piece. It's a nice piece that you can use. So Data Factory itself is when you create it, the Azure marketplace is nice and straightforward. Don't worry, I'm not going to do the whole blooming thing for a dog and pony show for you. That would be a little bit too lengthy. But you know what's great about the Logic app? You fool! What am I doing? Sorry. You can tell it's a Thursday, can't you? Apologies. So as you get into a Data Factory, there's only one version. Now, there is a couple of things to note as you create your Data Factory environment. There are a couple of different methods. What Microsoft in particular have been great at doing is they allow for the persisting of an environment. So there's a concept of serverless, there's a concept of dedicated, there's a context of, you know, some different higher memory, low resources, high resources, low memory, just depending on all the different scenarios that you're going to go through. It's going to go straight to review and create. But yeah, so the things that you're always going to want to note is if you're ever in a region, always pick the same region for every tool that you use, because then your latency is all the way down. Instead of having to go, well, I'm on the East Coast for my Data Factory, my databases are on the West Coast, I'm facing the wrong way. And so therefore any connection that these things are making have to jump across the country. Keep everything localized. They don't necessarily have to be local to where you are. I personally use East US more than I do anything else, because whenever there's preview features in Azure, they generally hit the East and West before they do the Central. So that's my rule of thumb, is to pick one or the other, stick with it, and sort of go down that path and stick there. But wherever you choose, be consistent with it and keep that sort of going through.
Hey, George, could you please zoom your screen to a larger font size, please?
Sure.
Cheers.
Is that enough?
Folks, is that better?
Yeah, looks good to me.
Fair enough. Now I'll have to do it on every one of them, I think. A little bit here. This one's a bit more manual. So yeah, when you get into Data Factory, the first thing you're going to see is this. And so I'm going to set up the scenario of, I have this file. It's not the biggest file in the world. It's a demo, but sort of like theoretically, Excel files only go to 1 million or so consistently. I think that's kind of been a rule of theirs for a very long time. It's kind of redundant. You can go beyond that, but it's just kind of a mess. Some of the testing we've actually done, which we found very interesting, is CSVs, comma separated, or any kind of delimiter separated files such as pipe, tab, squiggle. I don't know what that's called offhand, but the little squiggle, delimited, all of those kinds of files. In general, they're going to be more lean because they're less costly in terms of size. But whatever your file sample is, you know, the use case for using Data Factory up front is it's too big to just run with and just play with in its environment that it has. That, or you have multiple that you need to play with. So if your file is absolutely huge, or you have a few files that you need to put together, this is when Data Factory becomes really good, because you can only take files on their own so far, and then you know you get to the question of scale. So the use case for Data Factory up front is scale. How do you make it so you don't have to do everything locally? You don't have to do everything sort of in a way which is just not fast or efficient. And if you have multiple things to do, then it's going to slow you down. So by having Data Factory and bringing it through to a data lake or a SQL Server, that's kind of the power that you can kind of bring. So what we're looking at here is some raw transport data. So by transport, we're very lucky at Fulton to have a relationship with a company called Flight Vector. So one of the things that I've always found very good about working with the emergency medical services is that the data is a lot more interesting and open than it is for a lot of other industries. So when it comes to working with this data, it's really a lot of fun. So they've given us an example data set from a no longer an existing client, which is great. And it has all kinds of data in. So one scenario that we found is, you know, you've got your longitude, latitude. I need a way of formatting that consistently because it's not all tools can pick up longitude, latitudes in the same way. There's a lot of decimal places. There's a lot of different bits in here. But this data is essentially still raw data. So that's kind of what we're going to angle for and go with. So with every Data Factory instance and any cloud-based tool you have, one of the things that you're gonna need to start on how to do is, how do I connect my data from my on-premise instance to where I am now? So there's loads of different ways that you can achieve that. If it's from a cloud solution, then you know there's a lot of different automatic plugin tools. So if you do go to something like Salesforce, where you have to pull up a whole load amount of data, Data Factory is excellent at actually just sort of having those plugins in. So if you go to to those worlds, you can have your services and apps. You can connect directly to so many of these pieces without having to do any additional installs, without having to mess around too much. You can just connect, bring it through, and have all your data in front of you. Now, this is really a powerful tool. One thing that Microsoft was really good at doing back when the cloud first came along was saying, you know, this is only going to work if we can get to all of these other data points and all these other data sources that are outside of our purview. And so by having the relationship, by working with Snowflake, by working with Salesforce, and bear in mind, a lot of these are essentially sort of direct competitors. Oracle, for example, you know, getting through to Oracle and being able to move things around, that was a huge win. And I think Microsoft really played the market well at that point. However, when you go to these other scenarios, you know, if you go into Azure, you can move things cleanly with an integration runtime that's already there, it's already established. But when you go to on-premise, then there is additional steps that is required. In order to get to your data, which is on-premise, there's something called the self-hosted integration runtime. Now, I don't know if anyone's had to deal with that before. Luckily, it's very simple. Basically, it walks you through being able to connect to the pieces from DB2, from hopefully not Microsoft Access, no offense to anyone if you're using it. Not for enterprises, great for having fun with. SAP, then you need to do that install somewhere local to where that instance is held and somewhere where it can access that data. Now, there's a few different concepts there. Some people install those multiple integration runtimes, one per server where it resides, with the concept being, if you put it as close to the data as possible, then the data can flow through nice and quickly. There's no latency. It's a speedy process, which for if you want as live to the minute type data is not the worst solution by any means. However, my preference is you're able to set up a server where you can install the integration runtime and then allow all of the different access models to go, or accesses to go through that server. Then you have a disconnect between your production systems and the system that you're on. And why that's important is if something happens, you can just shut down that server where the integration runtime is, and it doesn't affect any of your production systems. They will carry on. The only thing that's going to stop is the automatic refresh of any data that's coming through if you have that in place. So yes, you install the integration runtime, and then from that point, you can cancel out that. From that point, you can connect up any of your link services. So a link service is how, well, the integration runtime is how you can get from your cloud to on-premise. It doesn't have anything except the ability to have pass-through sort of security to say, well, can you even access this space where this resides? Yes. Okay, good for you. That's as far as it's going to go. If you want to connect to something specific, such as a SQL server or file system, so you can pull out CSVs, whatever else, then you need to create a link service to that area specifically. Now, a link service can be quite open. What I'm going to show you here is just sort of quick walkthrough on how connecting to an Azure database can look like. So the auto-resolve integration runtime is one that's the out of the box for Azure. It connects from Azure to Azure. It allows a lot of those things. If you do have the self-hosted, then it would also appear here once you've installed it. I'm not going that far. I have got no need in my local system to need an entire integration runtime infrastructure there. I've built it before, but I did get a new laptop and I didn't replicate it. But really, everything is secured going through. As you go through all of your different pieces, you can pick up, it will load it through. If you know where you're going, if you know what you're doing, it's nice and inherent. Your SQL Server authentication, you can do those things and then just do a test of the connection. So, oh, it's on a different screen. Oh, good. I got scared there. Let's just say I'm not getting it from LastPass. Ooh, am I right? Yeah. That is not very secure right now by what I've heard from the other day. But yes, you can go through, you can put it in and you can test your connections and work through that way. So the thing that's worth noting is there are different ways of accessing. So if you're in the medical industry, once you've set these up, you can adhere things to a lot more stringent type of connection. There's the endpoints. You can have the additional parameters and make it about as secure a connection as you're possibly going to be. I've seen all variety of stringency or policies that people have in those scenarios. For the vast majority of people that aren't working with extreme high sensitivity data, this is more than secure enough to bring through what's there. I'm going to be blocking this because I've already got
yeah, I think in normal scenarios, like you're sending the data over public network, right?
Yes, for the vast majority, public network is really enough for the majority. Now, I'm not going to go through and talk security in any great depth, but in those scenarios, yes, if you're controlling everything, as long as all of your other practices are in place, then it's normally more than secure enough for the vast majority of businesses. There are more data sensitive organizations and industries out there where those are available, like I said, but going through the public part is usually more than enough, to be fair. So yeah, you can go through, you can put in all your pieces and you can discard that. I already have it here, so I can open up and show. It's going through the integration runtime. It's got all the pieces here. You can tell it's running, and that's nice, and that's all we need. So the managed private endpoints, this is where you start going through and having the more sort of definitely in the medical scenario where people are a lot more focused with their endpoints. The other thing I have connected here is the storage container. This is just an Azure blob storage scenario. This is just another form one. And it's actually where I put the file that I referenced here. I put it in there for the demo purposes, just to keep time down, because if I start going through all of those pieces, it can get a bit lengthy. But so what I've done for now is I basically just placed it through and put it in its own container. So whilst blob storage is good and we don't have the hierarchical namespace, otherwise I would have, at least I don't think I do. Yeah, I didn't make it into a data lake, probably by accident, but there we are. And so if you can get everything in there, then one of the first steps will be the on-premise into the data lake. What I'm actually showing you now is the data lake into the SQL Server, but again, all the concepts are the same. I'm just doing it with the copy task pieces, and that's a lot of fun. One thing I always enjoy pointing out is this piece here, the default access tier. I don't know how many people are familiar with sort of data lake storage, but there's hot and cold. So to describe it in the most rudimentary of terms, hot storage is data that you can land there and that you're going to use. The concept being storage is cheap, is more expensive than if it's in cold. However, the query capabilities, the query resources that get applied are much cheaper. So it's hot storage, it's always available, but the payoff that you get is you can query it as many times as you like without any sort of real cost incursions that would come otherwise. Now, cold storage is the opposite. Cold storage, you can, it's your old databases that you're not going to use anymore. It's all the old files that you've been collecting for years from your website software that you haven't found a use for yet. You put it in cold storage. Storage is significantly cheaper. However, to query against it is a lot more expensive. And so that's where that trade-off happens. So when you do have the create your storage account, differentiating whether you want it in the hot or the cold storage is really the part where you've got to focus. So once you have everything connected, and hopefully I've made it sound as simple as it really is, you just got it's a once and done scenario. Once you have it set up to access to have your database, once you have it set up to whatever your on-premise or whatever your source is, you're done. It's a one and done. You don't have to do it for every single scenario. You just have to do it that once. But it really is, it's as logical as you would think it would be. Here are my sources in the my data sources. I just want to connect to it. This is how I connect to it, done and done. And so once you are at that point, then now you have the ability to go through and say, okay, I'm going to build up my pipelines. I'm going to move these data pieces from one place to another. And I'm going to show you just how simple that really is. I genuinely think that even with, when Fulton hires a new employee, there's a lot of people that are intimidated by this is data factory. This is, quote, serious stuff is what someone says versus sort of I'm in Power BI and I can do some visualizations. But, it's more intimidating than it really is. I mean, and that's absolutely true. Absolutely, it can get complex. Absolutely, you're going to come scenarios where you're doing a lot more than just moving a file from A to B. But there's definitely some tips and tricks as you do it that can keep things more simple and more manageable and more scalable. So I'm going to go through each one of those as we go. So when you create one, you really are just doing a new pipeline, creates it, give it a name. Now, I've been kind of flippant with names in past demos before, I'll be honest. But I think one of the most absolute serious things that I have really adhered myself to, which I really should share and not mess around with, is a naming convention can make or break your entire scenario, whatever it may be. And I think that's the same with database management. I think it's the same with organizing your files in any kind of AI scenario. If you don't call it something that's clear and obvious and that guides you in the direction that you want to go in, you're only going to mess yourself up. Just imagine if you come back to a name that's ambiguous in 6 months' time when the context is gone, you've done other things since then. If you can't look at it and say to yourself, I know what A is, I know where it's going, and I know where it's from and what it's called, without having to dig through, or without digging, then you've done it right. If you can't do that, that really is a troublesome piece that you now have to spend probably a lot of hours, or someone else coming in and taking over from what you've done, spend a lot of hours on something that really is unnecessary. So my rule of thumb, and this is just my example, is where am I getting this data from? You know, Excel. Well, it's an Excel document, simple as pure as. I'm bringing it through from data lake, let's say, Azure data lake. I'm going to Azure database, and it's the file name is called with raw transports. So I mean, you can have it in whatever flavor you like. It really does not matter. In this scenario, I'm coming from the source of the data lake. Oftentimes, if it's an on-premise SQL server, I'll use the acronym SQL, or MSQL if it's Microsoft, MySQL if it's MySQL. You know, being as clear as possible is definitely the best way forward. Now, I know that there's going to be scenarios where, well, if I call it MySQL, then, you know, what happens when we migrate away from the MySQL, in which case that's fair. So the other methods you can come up with of what is the source exactly. You know, so you could be more explicit and call it, this is my transport ops environment. It's going from my Azure database. And so there's so many different ways you can do it, but just make it as clear as possible. It will save you a significant amount. I know I'm repeating myself, but you cannot underestimate the power of doing that alone will make to everything, especially in an enterprise solution, all day long. I'm going to go with simple Azure Data Lake to Azure Database and then what it's called, and just go with that. So the most rudimentary of things that you'll ever do, and what the vast majority, honestly, of what people do in Data Factory is this copy data task. And a copy data task really is you know, something nice and obvious. It's the raw transport files, is data movement going from A to B. Name it what you like. I'm not going to go through the same fire and brimstone again, but that's really it. So what each of these pieces in this copy data task do is there's the general, where you can give it a name, a brief description. Timeouts and retries are really profitable if you use them correctly, and they kind of mean exactly what it is. A timeout is, you know, they've got these handy little things. If something is running for too long, or in some scenarios not connecting, then it just says, well, it's been this long. We know it's never going to go this long. When it's working, we'll just use that as our timeout piece so we can go back to the beginning. The reason that's there is that in any scenario, you can have, so we've had to connect to it wasn't SAP, it was some really old, like black screen, green writing environment. It was a very old IBM thing that's definitely been updated. And so when it would connect, it would just hang and just hang. So without the timeout piece there, it does have the scenario sometimes of just, it will just never go. It will just keep going 24 hours, 38 hours, you know, and then someone notices and says, okay, that's a problem. Whereas if you set a timeout, then yeah, those are the things you don't normally put in place unless you have to, and as you're doing your troubleshooting with things. And a retry, if something fails, how many times do you want to try it again? Another one that you want to be careful with, because, you know, if it fails once because it can't connect because it's broken, you know, do it another 5 times, you're just going to get the same answer, and just use resources in them, in those things. And that's how quickly it tells you to wait before you retry it. Secure output and input. Yep, login and those kinds of things. They're not things I particularly use. So as we go through these other ones quite quick, the source, nice and easy. It's the source. The sink, don't know why it's called sink. It's destination. Let's call it destination, but sink is what we're going to go with because that's what they've called it. The mapping, which is very important step, settings, which can give you a little bit more of control, parallelism. So if you want, if it's a massive file, you can have it like 7 connections at once, 20 connections all going against that file at once and running in parallel. So if you have a billion rows and you want to say, well, I kind of want that going a bit faster, you can have multiple parallel, that word, and just have a lot of things moving through all at the same time and make things more efficient. Obviously, you have to have the CPU to be able to handle that. So don't just blindly think, well, if I do more, it'll be faster. You have to kind of plan for it. But yeah. And then user properties, which generally I don't think most people really use very much. So the ones we're going to focus on is source and sync. And the source obviously is where it's coming from. In this case, the source that we're going to go against is the blob storage one that I created. It's an Excel file, nice and easy. Another naming convention must do is whatever it is that you're calling it, be clear. You know, it's you know, so my rule of thumb is whatever the file is or whatever the table is named in the source, call it the same thing. If you have, say, raw transports in this scenario, if it's raw transports and you decide to call it happy transports, then, you know, but then you bring in another file called completed transports and then you build it up. If it's not obvious which one you've got it from because you've renamed them and it's not clear, that again is a use case of difficult to manage, difficult to maintain, because now you have to go and dig through things. Make things as simple as you can, always, every time. So this is where you get to pick the link service. And this, in this case, it's the storage container. You can browse through in your environment. I didn't think I did that. My bad, I apologize. Yeah, so you have to actually allow it to interact with things within the environment instead of just it doesn't assume that it allows you to get to everything unless you allow it to get to everything. I must have allowed it on the database side, but not here, which I'm curious about because I did this earlier. But anyway, you pick your file, you pick your file location, you flow it through. What I do like about picking Excel documents and the like in that regard is you can do it by the Excel document name. I don't like doing that at all. The other option is by doing it by the index. So if you have a client where they send you a file every month, week, day, not the best scenario, but still, you can still pick it up. If they call the first tab something different every time, or if it's not always going to be guaranteed to be fixed, then going against the index instead is a much better way of doing it. 0 is always going to be the first sheet, 1 the second, 2 the third. It just makes it so the name is redundant and it just picks up. As long as they're in the right tabs, then you can laugh all the way through. So that's an extra little piece that I always add. There's none here because we haven't picked one. Luckily for us, here's one I made earlier because I'm mildly prepared, so that's good. So the index in this scenario, it's the first sheet. So I've got that. You can even do a preview on the data. Whoa. Oh, it's enabling it again. Yeah, my bad. So it's part of the same thing. So good job. This demo is really good and I planned for these things. And so that part's there. So then you do the same for the database. So once you go select the Azure database, whatever your scenario is, you go against the link service and the integration runtime, and then it allows you to do these pieces here. So I have a table called completed requests. And so how these get utilized is, so in here, I get to select the data set that I created. So again, from raw transports into my database in this scenario. So I'm just picking the data sets that are there. And yep, so you can have your source. I might have to scroll out a little bit, apologies. Hopefully we can still see it. Is this still clear enough here? Or is it too small?
It looks good to me.
One answer, I'll go with all of them. That's good.
Yeah.
So you have your source, you have your sync. This button here is probably the most important part because this is where it imports the schemas, which is a really great tool to have. Now, it's not always going to have everything perfect, but I tell you what, doing these kinds of things manually can be painful. If you have a table with 100 columns, going through, getting the names of all 100 columns to what you want them to be, getting the data types, which is a bigger thing on all 100 columns, is an absolute nightmare. You don't want to be doing that. So having it have a little bit of pieces here. String to bit. It is a bit, I know that, but that's it'll give you warnings for the things that you should be concerned about. And yeah, date times, cancel date times, all those pieces. So this is the stuff where it would, you can have it there. If you want to keep that around, you can take the risk. It's up to you. That's really what it's doing. The mapping is allowing you to say, well, I have the file that I have. I want to take it from A to B. This is how I want you to write it into the database. All those pieces, and that's good. Now you can turn on fault tolerance. Normally, this is worth pointing out as well, because if you turn on the fault tolerance and have skip incompatible rows and have it logged somewhere, that's all well and good, but make sure you communicate that with your end users that are going to pick up the data, because it could be that if they're expecting to see 100 rows, but there's been 3 errors and now they're getting 97, if they're not paying attention or they're not aware that there should be 100 in the first place, then their data could, their outputs could potentially be wrong. On the other side of it, they could be asking the question of where's my other 3? And then it's a discussion of, well, have we set it up right? Or have you sent me files which have just got some really duff data in that are just breaking things? And you'll get every single question and response to those scenarios as you're able to get. And then once you're ready, you can do a debug or a trigger, and you can have it trigger manually. You can do all those things. In this scenario, just going to copy the data over. I haven't tested this, so we'll see if it fails. And if it does, then me showing how simple this is to do is really successful. Looks like it's queuing and running. So yeah, from the most fundamental level, this is why this process is good. It really is as simple as, once you have things set up, it really is just a case of copying things over, and just checking out, making sure that you bring things there. And what is pretty great about that is, it does allow you to start having some better scenarios of, I'm now in a place where I can use the tools that I need to use. I always use I'm crap at analogies, but bear with this one. But I use the one of the ladle and the spoon when it comes to soup. So if you're local, a lot of the tools that you're going to be using locally, if they're not enterprise scale stuff and you have enterprise scale data, use Power BI for the volumes that Power BI can handle, because that's you eating Power BI is the spoon, you're eating your soup, and it's nice and tasty. When you get masses of data, then using a spoon and a bowl is not going to do it anymore. You need to put it into the big old vat. You need to get your ladle out to start distributing the soup around a lot better. And so use the right tools for the job. If you can handle it on premise and just do it locally, then fine. If you can if you can't, then move it to somewhere where you can have much more of an impact with that stuff. And then end of the day, where did I hide that one? That's here. A little bit of, here's one I built earlier, but I know I'm not sharing the screen just yet. Hang on one moment. So now we've just got all this stuff in the database, and so you can start doing all of your analysis there. So one thing that I feel strongly about personally, and I'm so aware this is a personal preference, is that SQL for me is the easiest way to look at and visualize data and do a lot of that stuff. Tools like Power BI is really good for that as well. But what what I find it powerful for is, well, now I have my data. Where are my gaps? What's my inconsistencies? So even as I look straight away, I'm looking at these columns here and thinking, are these just all zeros? I'm doing a top 1,000 now. I could look at everything. And so you can just immediately just sort of word cycle and you can just do your analysis. And this is where SQL becomes powerful, because ultimately now I've done that, I now know that, well, it doesn't matter what my outputs are, that's irrelevant to my outputs, it's not going to do anything. So having the ability to use some of these tools to make it a lot quicker than just looking at an Excel document, looking at other things, you know, getting it somewhere else to be able to work with that data to do a lot more is huge, in my opinion. And if you do want to take it to the next step, then you can make a Power BI document. In my scenario, I use Power BI a lot for that, because you can then test the relationships between tables to make sure that they're working correctly. You can do data integrity testing much easier when you can see what's there and say, okay, well, if I filter on this, then there's a significant amount of gaps where there shouldn't be. That's where bringing things into the cloud and doing things with these other tools, that's where the power comes in. And that's really sort of a large amount of why I think, you know, knowing how easy a lot of these tools are and then using them and building them out, that's, you know, that's the power. Having the data cleaned up, having it ready so that you can ingest it into AI. That really is, to loop it back to the beginning, that's where so many people are not. There are so many people that just want to go straight into doing things without having any of those integrity checks, without doing all that stuff. And people have the desire to do it, because, especially these days, because they hear these buzzwords of big data, AI, machine learning, all of this stuff. It's everywhere, especially with ChatGPT being so fun as what it is, has been in the last however many months. It's been huge for 2 months, whatever. So yeah, that's why having this scenario is great. Sorry. So yeah, to switch it back to the to the PowerPoint, sorry. So yeah, I'm very aware that there's so many different flavors of these things. Every scenario is different. I even wrote a blog post recently where my primary role for a long time now has been to go and have client conversations with existing clients, with potential clients. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that's been in this scenario. But what I've genuinely learned from this is that, you know, you can have a SQL Server, an Excel, and an API. They can be coming from the same exact companies and same systems. The way people are using them is never going to be the same. So therefore, the way you treat them as you go into staging, everything, there's no two scenarios I've come across where it's the same. Hopefully, at least by showing, so like the rudimentary paths to a basic scenario of move data from A to B, allow you to do extra pieces. That helps some people in some scenarios. I know I'm not exactly Mr. AI in an applied AI presentation, but at least I can have this presentation give you some context of how you can get that data ready for such things, because that really is a large part of the next stage of all the advanced intelligence and analytics that you know just too often goes under the radar. Having that infrastructure, having the basis, having the foundations, that's really important if you want to not only bring it through and build something, but maintain it and keep it building going forward. So, so yeah, I hope this has at least been vaguely helpful. And yeah, any questions? That's where I'm at now.
All right, George, thank you so much for that. That was really hands-on. I love the examples. I mean, the one thing that stood out in my head was, you know, 100% right on the variable naming, right? I love it when I go into any software development application and it just says, you know, data or data one, right? And so the more you can, not even for yourself, but even for other people, obviously, right, to try and track where things are coming from. That is a great tip, More people need to be doing that for sure. Yeah, I will say, anybody want to, Madhu, it looks like maybe you're unmuted. Were you going to ask a question?
No, I'm just listening. Sorry.
Gotcha. Okay, well, if anybody would like to ask a question, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, this is Srinivas.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me? All right, thank you, George, for that presentation. That was really good. So one question I was asking is like, we're building all these data pipelines for AI or machine learning. Can you talk about some of the challenges you might have faced that you faced where the data is not being aggregated for the machine learning component to work properly?
So if something's not working properly, or if the data.
No, I mean, like
in-
the labels are not, you're not capturing all the labels, because like in the enterprise system, you have flat files, JSON data, structured data.
Yep.
So the data is spread across in the data lake. Now, but there are some challenges where the data engineers, they don't understand all the different pieces. And like, is there like a process you follow, or like,
There is. So again, this is another scenario where there can be multiple things that it can be and where it comes up on. So I mean, data integrity is the loose label that people apply to it, but I think in fact this might be repetition for some, because I know this is what I was saying to you, Justin, in some ways, is that it's twofold. One, data engineers and all the data processing that we go through, just because we're familiar with the technology, just because we understand how those things can be put together, doesn't mean we know the data or the business. So you do have to lean on the business quite often. And so there is a very valid part of the conversation where if the data is just bad, you can push back and just say, look, your data's crap. And I hate saying garbage in, garbage out, but I've said it. It's if you're not going to put the effort into process, if you're not going to put the effort into making sure that what you're bringing through is consistent, and those kinds of things, then that's a large part of where things can go wrong. So there is a scenario where you can push back on the business to say, well, we can fix this here, but it's going to happen again. So that's definitely one. I do have, this is actually, I'm going to end this. I'm actually going to show this other slideshow, which I just brought up. And in my opinion, this is a large amount of what's quite important as well. So process refinement and going through data integrity and visualization. So this is from an EMS presentation I did. There's lots of different ways of identifying something which is wrong. One being like there's blank data when there shouldn't be blank data. That's a scenario where I'd push back on whoever the people putting the data are in, and saying, look, there's no scenario where you have flown a plane and you haven't recorded what plane it is. That's you, go fix that. That's one. The next one is, and so this is the example of once you've cleaned it up, it changes the view of something. So this data is the same as the other one, where the blanks and the cleanups have happened because there's also some, there's some misnaming with some lowercase blanks missing and spaces and stuff. When you clean the data up, the story you're getting is very different. So there is the scenario where you can push back on them. The other one, did I miss the other one? Yeah. So this other one is, this is more frustrating and annoying than anything else. When you have values which, and I think this might be leaning slightly more towards you were referring to, I suspect, I could be well off, so you tell me, where there is valid data points available, but the ones they're picking are other, blank, null, miscellaneous. That's garbage data. That's data that, well, you've given them the option, they've chosen it because either they're lazy or it's just you haven't given them enough options to truly give them an accurate choice of what it is that they can have. So by having, that's a large part of data integrity that doesn't get talked about, because you have to, adult, yes, but there's some pediatric, but where does this fall? If this is all pediatric and it's just the process on that team, you're getting completely inaccurate data. And that's something that is hugely favorable to being talked about. And that is a process change. And one of the hardest things to change, you can change technology, you can build that stuff, and that's going to be relatively speedy. compared to changing a process and changing human process on that side. So whenever that scenario comes up, it's, you know, the first port of call is to say, well, let's sit down and understand what these gaps are with the business or with the stakeholder, whoever that scenario is, and then having the conversation of, well, it's not wrong, it's just that your process is crap, or whatever that scenario is. And then, but if it is wrong, then you can fix it, because technology allows you to go through and fix something. So I don't know if that quite touches what you're going for, but that for me is an absolute fundamental on the conversation of data prep and integrity.
Sure. Thank you, George.
Srinivas, I think in the this is my observation in the large corporations where they have lots of data, they do employ some master data management and also data profiling techniques. And on top of that, some tools continually monitoring the quality of the data as well. You have products from Informatica and IBM and such. So that's how they typically improve the quality of the data in the, you know, large systems where data is constantly streaming into these systems.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
And in the case of data lake architecture, we always tend to have it's not a proper data, it will be unstructured data, video or any raw files or JSONs coming into that. It's always tend to have an unstructured data, which we in data lake itself, we never tend to have the proper data out there. Right. So it's is there any ways you ever gave access to power users or any other users directly to data lake to understand the data and identify some anomalies or cleanse, how we can cleanse and how utilize the data? So
So if I go back to, actually, I think I have a nice example here. It's not the same. It's boiled down to a non-technical audience. So I apologize if it's.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, non-technical audience. So I apologize when this was created. So, but for the example, we have that. I mean, it's. I always find it's the pyramid, or the upside down pyramid effect. So the vast majority of users are going to be in Power BI itself for this example. You know, you're going to get a few that are able to work with data models and create things off of data sets. You're going to get those that have modeled. But as you go further down the path, you're going to have fewer and fewer and fewer people that are interacting with those pieces. So the Azure Data Lake, being one of the first ports of call, is generally going to be somewhere which is pretty highly restricted, and not a lot of people are going to have much access to it. It kind of, but as it is the place where a lot of downstream functions come out, that's usually the scenario I'll find people going in there, because they need to identify their data points that they're either extracting into a machine learning tool, into Jupyter Notebook, into wherever it is that they're going to, be it SQL Server. So that's the place where people will go to review and find out what it is they want to do something with. I've never really come across any scenario where people go in just to have a look about, because it's not in any kind of format which is suitable for that. And there's always going to be a tool applied on top of it, so that gives them the ability to do it, but not going in directly and doing it that way. The advantage of a data lake Gen 2, for example, is that hierarchical format, instead of, because blob storage just holds files. You know, there's a few things with it, is if you try and delete something, then it can overwrite things easily. But having the hierarchical namespaces applied there, that really gives you a lot more structure to that, and so that can help towards that kind of thing. But yeah, hopefully I've answered the question there. But as I said, the further back you go, the less need there is for people to use it, unless they're applying something to it to visualize it in the way that they need to see it for their specific role.
Yeah, that's right. That completely agree. That's right. So basically, what was happening in our companies recently is, so they always tend to have using these enormous flat files. The users like to use these flat files, and we were tend to move out of these flat files and provide to use, make them adapt to new technologies and work through that. In these scenarios, when they are getting the data through flat files or anything, there's a first, it's more faster for them. They have access to those files, so they can create their own dashboards in Power BI and exposing to the users. But when we tend to move that to the Azure data lake in these areas, so there is a kind of resistance to them, because I mean, we have an ETL process, go to data lake, and then it will go to, we have a SAP systems out there, so warehouses. So in this ETL process, which they don't like in this, but they need to understand the sustainability for long term.
Yes.
So in these cases, sometimes we face issues like asking, like, why can't we directly use from data? Like, why can't we use directly? Because we used to do that before. So there we were trying to address their issues, telling that we wanted to be more agile in some areas, and but not to provide, as you said, that's the right point, that it should be cleansed and the users should be more skilled enough to understand the data.
You've just underlined the process change. The human element of a process change is the most difficult one to work with. Because people, especially if they've been there 20, 30 years, and you'll hear that they've been there 20, 30 years, every single time they're not getting their way with a new system. Not a dig at anyone, hopefully not said that. But yeah, it is a better, more safe, more secure as well, because the thing with flat files is, again, especially with the huge corporations, especially. So my background is definitely more financial industry than so the brokerage and security transfer and that kind of stuff over the medical, though I've done a huge amount in those large corporations as well. You know, compliance and risk and all of those things becomes one of the largest conversations ever. You have to go through every single compliance training. You have to completely adhere to it. And their infrastructure, especially around Azure, is stringent at the minimum. So if people are requesting to say, well, I want to get to the files themselves and I want to bring it locally, they're creating risk by doing that. So having the conversations of, well, as soon as you take it out of here, that's on you if something happens to it. And so there's many reasons for it. It's just really having those conversations and just trying to have people as well informed as to the risks, as well informed as to the reasons as to why it's happening. And then if they're still not happy, then some people are just never going to be happy. That's, you know, being as open and you know, explaining the why of something being better and what makes it better is really the only path to that. But it's an important step for adoption to happen. There has to be buy-in. The lack of buy-in, it just makes it more uphill.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for the details. Thank you.
So no democratization of data then? So
I'm
you
assuming
know,
that's aimed at
yeah, just a couple of years ago, it's all about, we need to democratize the data, right? You know, which means you are opening up all sort of a data in the organizations for all sort of a processing, including AI. So, you know, but then comes again, like, you know, the compliance and other aspects, right? So I think sometimes these things come and go. Like one of them is the democratizing the data itself.
Yeah.
And there's a cost to it, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Particularly if you have data in the cloud, the ingress is free, not the egress.
Right, sure.
That's right. Those were the give and takes with being in the cloud sometimes. Yeah.
And on top of that, some teams try to create data lakes, and other teams are creating muddy puddles everywhere.
Oh yeah, that I've been. Yeah, I hear you completely.
Yeah, I thought I was listening to the choir when I came in, and I was right. So it's all good. That's fine.
We
Sorry.
tried something like that in one of the previous company I used to work for that. So we kind of create a catalog of, data, catalog of the data, and then also we define the purpose of that data and how they can utilize it. The data can be in the cloud, data can be in on-prem SQL, et cetera, but we say that this is the data that you could utilize, and they look at this catalog of information and then, and then request access for it, and then they could do whatever they want. That's also short-lived though, but majority of the people actually use Power BI reports, like George was mentioning in the beginning of the call.
So with respect to democratization, I think what you said, that's still as a motto for our company. So where we wanted to democratize and provide self-service option for a lot of users. In that case, basically what we were doing is we are opening up the data based on governing that. Basically, let's say we have the huge data set. We open up a complete data set to them with governing some areas. In Power BI, they can use those data sets, how many fields they want, how many things they need. We have a lineage documentation. We create that so they understand what's the data is there. Some of the power users, that way they are leveraging the data. We have the warehouse itself cleansed and put together, but we open up whole of the tables in some areas. And the only concern which we had was going through some areas to decommission these file systems and get that into the data lake. And some areas, what we have done is we identified one or the who will be the power users who are techie savvy and who will be the voice for IT. In each areas, it will be supply chain, it may be sales, it may be in every areas. We identified those and we put together as a group and we just train them, telling these complete concepts to them. And then they are the advocates to us and they are managing and they are the voice for IT in the user groups actually. So that's how we're trying to adapt, but still we have a lot of challenges there.
Can I ask a question on the data lineage? Like what tool or method that you guys are using?
So in data lineage versus we had basically an SAP. We have all the data in SAP HANA. It's the way which is a warehouse for us. We have a tool, basically a snapshot we call it, as it's a internally created. We created ourselves. Going through the lineage concept, it's a smart function module which we ran. That what it do is we will have the consumption layer, transformation layer, and reporting layer, right? So in that reporting layer, we run that on each. We call it as calculation user within HANA. So when you run that on that lineage, it creates a document on each of the calculation views. So it tells you when we put it that in a file system, it gives the complete lineage. When it just what we have done is there's a portal site which we update there. When they just search in that portal site, it will give the complete lineage of that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Good. Well, good. We're kind of coming up on time here. I want to be respectful of everybody. We usually kind of ended around 8 o'clock Central Time. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. George, of course, thank you so much for all your expertise here. And I posted a link inside the chat with regards to our conversation on the podcast as well that we did a couple of weeks ago. So if anybody wants to check out that is still there in the chat, or you can just go to podcast.appliedai.mn. and you can get a list to all of the podcasts we've been doing. I'm always looking for other people that want to be on the podcast, so just reach out to me But yeah, it was an awesome conversation. We covered a lot of these things, but in addition to a lot of other things, I guess, around mental health and keeping your sanity here during the pandemic. But George, I want to thank you so much for being here tonight and sharing with us all of your experience.
Thank you for having me. It's fun.
And next month, we've got April 6th, addressing the high failure rate of AI and ML projects, examples from the field. So if you get a chance, please go out to appliedai.mn and sign up for that one as well. So look forward to seeing everyone back here. Until then, forward to seeing you next month. And thanks again, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.